Good morning and welcome to a new episode of Future of Europe. I am Ilona Nido and I'm delighted to welcome today Lola Calixete, a student from the Catholic University of Lille in the master's degree European Law and Litigation. Today we'll be discussing a recent and significant case, Commission v. Hungary. The key question discussed today will be what does this case mean for Europe's future and for environmental protection. Thank you, Lola Calixete, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, could you enlighten us on what the Hungary wastewater case is about and why it is important?
This case revolves around Hungary's failure to meet the requirements of the Directive 19/271 EEC, which deals with the treatment of urban wastewater. Wastewater, if untreated, can pollute rivers, lakes, and the environment in general, and therefore harm public health. The European Union has rules in place that requires countries to collect and treat this water to protect both people and nature. In Hungary's case, the European Commission found that the country didn't set up adequate systems to collect and treat this water in some areas, therefore leading to this legal action. And as to why it's important, this case touches on two major issues, the first being the environmental protection, which is a core value of the EU, and the obligation of member states being the second. When a country like Hungary fails to meet these obligations, it can face serious consequences, not just for the environment, but also for its standing within the EU.
Okay, and could you tell us what were the main issues that led Hungary being found breaching the EU law?
Well, there were several main issues, but I'll just focus on the three most important. First, Hungary didn't put in place proper wastewater collection systems in some of the areas. EU law requires countries to build the system by certain deadlines, but Hungary failed to meet those. Second, even when Hungary had some systems in place, they didn't meet the EU secondary treatment standards. This means that the wastewater wasn't being treated properly before being released into the environment. And thirdly, in areas marked as sensitive, Hungary was required to use stricter wastewater system, but it didn't. Sensitive areas are those that are particularly vulnerable to pollution and that are crucial for ecosystems, so it's really important. While Hungary argued that it had done enough, the CJEU ruled that Hungary did not meet these higher standards. The legal foundation for this case comes from the rules set out by this directive, but also Article 258 of the TFEU. These articles allows the European Commission to take a country to court if it believes that they aren't fulfilling their obligations to the requirement of EU law.
And in your opinion, does this case reflect broader discussions in the EU regarding the future of Europe?
Well, this case isn't just about Hungary. It reflects a larger conversation within the EU about the balance between national sovereignty and EU-wide obligations. One of the big questions in Europe right now is how much power the EU should have over individual countries, especially when it comes to cross-border issues. This case shows that when it comes to issues like environmental protection, the EU expects countries to follow the same high standards, no matter their individual circumstances. The primacy of EU law is a key principle here. In this case, Hungary tried to argue that it could use its own water systems, but the EU court ruled that these systems did not meet the required standards. This ties into broader EU discussions. How much freedom should countries have to make their own decision, and when should the EU step in to ensure the same level of protection for all member states? This case could be seen as a test of the EU's role as a leader in environmental protection. With the European Green Deal and the goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050, cases like this show that the EU is serious about enforcing its laws to meet environmental goals.
And could you tell us more about how this case reflects the balance between national sovereignty and EU law?
In this case, the CJEU and the European Commission work together to ensure that member states uphold their commitments under EU law. The problem here is that while legal under Hungarian law, the individual systems did not align with stricter EU standards that were set out by the directive. This is a crucial point because it shows that while member states have some degree of flexibility in how they implement EU laws, it is the outcomes that must always comply with the EU's objectives. This flexibility comes with its limits, and member states must achieve specific, clear, and unequivocal results. This directive is not new, as it dates back to 1991, and it has given rise to numerous cases. Almost all states were sanctioned at one time on its basis because the objectives are high and costly for communities. Hungary has been sanctioned for failure, but not financially, whereas in other cases such as Commission versus France in 2004 or Commission versus Belgium in 2014, they were sanctioned financially, which can mean that the latest EU member states still have a period of adjustment. We can see a clear balance between the sovereignty of the member states and EU law, as there is only an obligation of results, meaning that proper urban wastewater treatments must be achieved, regardless of the methods that are chosen by the member states.
And what do you believe this case means for the future of environmental protection in the EU, and how does it connect to larger EU goals?
This case highlights a growing trend in the EU to take environmental standards seriously. The EU has positioned itself as a global leader in climate action with ambitious goals like the European Green Deal or the Nature Restoration Law. The wastewater case shows that the EU won't hesitate to take action against countries that fall behind standards. For the future of Europe, this means that environmental rules will likely become even stricter, with closer monitoring on how well countries are following them. It also shows that the EU will likely use cases like this to ensure that countries contribute to share of environmental goals, even if that means taking them to courts. There is a growing recognition that issues like climate change and pollution affect all of Europe, and that individual countries cannot solve them alone. This is why the EU insists on collective action in compliance with the Directive 91/271 EEC. In terms of the future, we could see the EU strengthen the enforcement of green policies and introduce even more ambitious environmental laws. The Hungary case is just one example of how the EU is using its legal system to make sure that every member state plays roles in protecting the environment, and how it is willing to use its abilities under Article 4 of the TFEU on shared competences between the EU and the member states to its full extent.
Well, thank you so much for your answers and your time, Lola Calixete, and thank you to everyone who have been watching this episode of Future of Europe.